Hey, all you remote learners out there, how are you today? So, today we're moving into Chapter 14, Section 1, and we might get a little bit into Section 3 as well, and we'll be finishing up with Chapter 14, Section 3 tomorrow. Now that, America is in World War II, we're going to be looking at basically how does America mobilize or prepare for war, and how does war impact people's daily lives? Who will be fighting in the war? What will happen to women? How will the war impact various groups in society, specifically like African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Japanese Americans? That's some of the specific groups we're really going to be looking at over the next couple of days. But today it's going to be more so about, what role does propaganda play? How do we mobilize our troops? How do we get enough supplies ready? Those kinds of things. So in this beginning section, it's just going to be on Chapter 14, Section 1 about mobilization or preparedness. Because just because December 8th, 1941, Congress declares war on Japan, it doesn't mean that we're ready to send troops that day or even the next day. It's going to take time. America had a peacetime draft already in place, but that doesn't mean that we have enough troops to go overseas. That doesn't mean that they're actually trained. We don't have enough supplies. We've been producing a lot of war goods. Remember, it's really just for our allies at this point. We had that whole lend-lease policy where we were kind of lending goods to the British without really payment. But we're going to have to supply our own troops with guns and tanks and planes and food and, uniforms. But we're also going to be sending supplies to the Russians and to the British, as it's going to be this combined effort to try to take out the Axis powers. So the first thing to really mention is a new law called the War Powers Act, where Congress passes this law which gave the president increased powers. It really expanded the power of the president, of the military, and of Congress itself. And it's really a dangerous situation. Whenever you have a war, usually the power of the military and of the president and of your legislative body increases. Unfortunately, in some countries, this becomes a jumping off point where a president can declare themselves dictator and they can justify their increased role of power and taking away rights from the people because it's a time of war and people are fearful of their own rights and want to protect their families, so they go along with the changes, and then it's too late and a dictatorship is in place. So luckily, in the United States, that's never happened here, but unfortunately, it is a path that has happened multiple times in other countries. And, during World War II, the government increases its power more so than ever before. It makes World War I kind of look like a baby in comparison. World War II, the US will spend more money than ever before to create jobs, to produce goods, but also to really control every aspect of people's lives as far as how much gas they buy, what foods they buy, what's produced in the store. And as people attempt to speak out against the government, we're going to see that their free speech and their free press are limited. We're going to see increased censorship. The government's going to be controlling the news and what people can find out about the war. And unfortunately, specific groups in America will be targeted. Just like German Americans were targeted in World War I, Japanese Americans will be targeted, in World War II. So it really is going to be a total war. And remember, a total war is just a war that affects civilians and soldiers. And as soon as the Japanese, attacked the United States, we really got involved in the war. And it truly hasn't touched the average American citizen. But there were fears after this, initial attack that perhaps the Japanese would take a cue from the Germans. And remember, the Germans had bombed London and just the people of England and all those bombings during the Blitz. So there was a real fear that San Francisco and other areas on the West Coast could be in jeopardy, or even on the East Coast. So people are willing, to give up their rights because they are afraid that we were living in this total war and that their families are in jeopardy. And so that's why they're so willing to go along with these changes. But they're obviously scary and different. Now, one of the big things that's going to be happening here is that FDR realizes that the way that we're going to win World War II is through technology and through production of goods. He says, you look at Italy, you look at Germany, you look at Japan, we can produce more goods than any of those countries. Germany had an impressive manufacturing capability. But Italy was really behind. They didn't have as many cities, they didn't have as many factories, and Japan did have a lot of factories and industrial power, but still, they're a small country only on several islands. They'd expanded and taken over Manchuria and such, but they really didn't have a lot of factories in some of those areas. They were relying on Manchuria for resources like food and such. So the idea here is that we can simply outpace, the other countries because we destroy their planes, we destroy their tanks, we destroy their guns as we come in, and they won't be able to reproduce them fast enough. And if we can really ramp up our production levels and outpace them, we can produce more things. And so it's the idea that weapons will really win the war. And so as FDR announces this national emergency, he really wants to be able to, create so many planes, so many tanks, and he's able to do that. We're really able to increase the speed at which we're producing planes, battleships, tanks. And of course, they're going to really be focused on trying to replace those battleships that were lost at Pearl Harbor. But luckily, we said those aircraft carriers were not destroyed, and it's not like all of our battleships were destroyed. Now, some people were very worried about the cost. This is all going to be paid for through taxes. The American people are going to be paying higher taxes than ever before. The U.S. also takes out loans, but we are spending so much more money than we ever had in American history. We are going to create a huge budget deficit. And the defense budget goes up to more than $17 billion. And remember, this is only the 40s, so this is huge. And we're using this money to produce as many weapons as possible, to lend to the Russians, to lend to the British, and to use for ourselves as we're fighting this war. There's this National Defense Advisory Committee, and they're really kind of trying to help mobilize the economy. They're working with business leaders, usually big business leaders like a Henry Ford, like a John Deere, trying to talk to them about, how can you structure your company? Can you not produce vehicles? And so literally, like in 1942, as you're going to see in the Crash Course video you watch, there's not going to be new models of cars. Instead, those companies are going to be producing tanks and plane parts and other such things. Now, obviously, some people say this borders on communism, and in a way it does, because the government is telling you what to produce, how much you have to get done each day, what the working hours are, how you should treat your employees. It's a lot of government control, but there's a justification in a time of war. But naturally, there are going to be people who are pacifists, who never believe in war, who think that war is wrong, and who are angry about the U.S. decision to go to war and feel like this is just socialist propaganda. This is just a way to secretly make us into a communist or socialist country. Most Americans, though, support the war, and you can see that in Congress as well. When it came to the vote in Congress, pretty much everyone voted in support of the war. There was only one candidate who voted against going to war with the Japanese and with the Germans, and that was a new congresswoman who had been elected, who was a pacifist, who said that, it was against her moral and religious beliefs. But otherwise, everyone really was in support of war. And I think more so than in World War I, most people in World War II felt this personal connection that we had to go to war because we'd been attacked on our own soil and so many Americans had died. Now, as these companies get these government contracts to produce tanks and planes and, vehicles for the war, they're basically on this, what we call this cost plus system, where basically the faster they work and they produce a good, they basically get a bonus, so to speak, and they make more money if they produce it even faster. And so companies are all about extending the working day. And so employees are going to be expected to work, we're going from 8 hours a day, which had been really kind of the norm during the Great Depression, to now 10, 12 hours a day, just so we can be able to get all the goods created. And just so you see that number at the bottom, by 1942, about 200,000 companies had converted to wartime production of goods. And so they're no longer making shoes, they're making, soldiers' boots, that kind of thing. There's going to be a lot of different groups here, and we've got the War Production Board, which is part of the Office of War Mobilization. And so they basically directed everything, and they told which factories to produce which goods so that there would be enough goods for the Allies to, outpace the Axis power. So they decided who's going to be building cars and tanks, who's going to be making helmets, who's going to be making, gas masks. Poison gas was not really heavily used in World War II. Most people frowned upon it, but people were still carrying around gas masks, fearful that the Germans would be using it. Of course, we're going to be seeing food being created, like canned food and different food for the soldiers that they can eat on the go. This is when M&Ms comes out, in fact, because they were looking for some kind of candy to include in the soldiers' meal kits. And so they were looking for some kind of chocolate that would, not melt, that you could be able to transport. And so that's when you get M&Ms, the whole idea that, it melts in your mouth and not in your hands, because nobody wanted a big Hershey bar all melted as they opened up their meal kit. So the government is working with some of these companies to develop, different products based off of different climates and environments the soldiers will be fighting in. Because remember, they're fighting in Africa. Remember where Rommel's at, leading the German troops as well as the Italian troops. They're fighting in Russia, over in Siberia, where it's freezing cold. And then they're fighting, throughout Europe. And they're going to have to be breaking into France. But then they're also fighting in the extreme heat in the jungles of, the Pacific, as they're going to be fighting in the Philippines and near Japan. And so it's just an extreme amount of climates. The government has to try to figure out how to fight this war on all these different fronts at the same time. And so if there would be any kind of disputes, the Office of War Mobilization would handle those and kind of settle arguments about who got which government contract to produce a good. The U.S. government spent $250 million per day from 1941 to 1945, and this is 2 times as much as all previous government spending combined. This is what you can see here in a factory, and the War Mobilization Board oversaw production of war equipment, which really isn't too different than what I already said. And here's Henry Ford's factory, made 1 B-24 bomber every hour, so no cars, as I said, in 1942, making plane parts. But that's really impressive that they're making a plane every hour. And you can see they're also working on making all these new battleships, as well as aircraft carriers to take on the enemy. Prefabrication allowed shipbuilders to make a battleship in 41 days rather than 244 days, meaning now they're starting to use pre-made parts. So you make some of the parts in different factories, and then they would actually assemble the ship later. Now, of course, because there was resistance by some people over the fact that, they have to work these long hours, they don't want their son to go fight. They're worried about, huge casualty rates. They're worried about not able to get food at the stores because the best food was going to the soldiers. They're just worried about everything. Propaganda, of course, as always, is going to be really important. And hopefully at this point, you've already watched the video and done the Decoding World War II Propaganda assignment, where you watched A Fuhrer's Face, where Donald Duck is having a nightmare that he's waking up in Nazi land. And propaganda was in the form of cartoons like that. It was in movies, it was in posters, it was on the radio, it was everywhere. And it was the idea they would have posters like loose lips, sink ships. So you don't know who's a spy. So don't be talking about the war. Don't leave any kind of important war information out and about, because there could be, spies and people who are trying to decode messages or send messages who might be living here in the U.S. There's, of course, propaganda, which makes, the Germans and the Japanese look like monsters. And as you notice in the picture on the left, they're often very drawn in a very racist or biased manner. A lot of the things that come out during this time period are not positive, especially towards the Japanese, since people have such anger towards them because they attack on Pearl Harbor. Most of the propaganda is about enlisting in the military, but it's also about buying war bonds or Liberty bonds, to help pay for the cost of the war, to offset those, high prices for everything. They're about, rationing food, saving and recycling scrap metal, planting your own victory garden, accepting rationing, that you can't, drive everywhere or, get food like you once had, donating blood, becoming a nurse. Unlike World War II, they're going to want women to serve in different military groups, like there's groups called the WAC and the WAVES. They're basically separate groups where women are kind of helping to organize different wartime activities. They're not like in combat yet, but this is more like organizing different stuff, logistical supply kind of stuff for the most part. So propaganda for anything and for everything, as you've been noticing. Captain America, of course, the comic comes out during this time period. And of course, Captain America lives on to this day, right? With the whole Marvel series. If you're a fan I'm a fan with all the different, comics and movies and the Avengers series and all that coming to life and TV shows on Disney Plus and such. But people are looking for heroes. They're looking for something to believe in, something that you can, defeat the bad guys. And nothing you really need to write down on this page is just as kind of a reminder that, the propaganda uses a variety of techniques, whether it's bandwagon, right, which saw that a lot in World War I, where they're saying everybody should enlist, everybody's doing it, so should you. Or they're doing a lot of name calling, where they're using a lot of negative symbols and words to try to make them look like an enemy. We see somewhat of card stacking, only presenting one side of the issue. Or we see sometimes glittering generalities, making everything seem like it's bright and shiny and new and wonderful, and just focusing on the positive. It's a little bit of card stacking in there, but really kind of focusing on the best qualities there. There's not usually a whole lot of testimonials in propaganda for wartime. It's a lot more focused on the emotional appeal of fear and such. And so I like this one in particular of Uncle Sam. This is one of the World War II ones, and Uncle Sam's like tough, and he's gotten rid of his hat and his coat, and he's rolled up his sleeves, and he's got an eagle with him, which I don't know, just makes me laugh. And somehow he's like striding towards the military, and it says enlist now in the U.S. Army. So obviously there's all sorts of propaganda, to get people to enlist or to buy war bonds, liberty or victory bonds, help offset the cost of the war. So let's talk a little bit now about the draft in general. So I've mentioned before, we watched a video clip about it a couple weeks ago, about how there already was a peacetime draft. They'd started that back in 1940 when the U.S. Army was only about 200,000 men total, between World War I and World War II. It was all about peacetime, isolationism, the Great Depression, so we'd really let our U.S. Service members and the amount in our military dwindle. And when they were having this peacetime Army practice, they were giving them, Campbell's soup cans with rocks in them and shaking them up and saying, okay, throw these, this will be your grenade practice. So they didn't really even have the supplies or the training. As it seemed like war was likely, and FDR was meeting secretly with Churchill, and they were planning this Atlantic Charter saying how we're going to defeat the bad guys. We're going to create a United Nations, a peacekeeping group one day after the war's over. We're going to help. They'd brought back, more thoughts on this. And FDR kind of was thinking probably secretly, okay, war's coming. And he'd been trying to push Congress, to get more people, involved in a peacetime draft. But still, because we were not officially at war and because people were still against going to war, this peacetime draft was not much of a true draft. It was more like, hey, here's some propaganda. Let's get you to sign up. It's more focused on voluntarism to get you to, if you're between 18 and 44 under the Selective Service Act, we really need you to sign up. But still, it really was based on voluntarism. They were not just going around like as you imagine a draft is, and they were just like being like, okay, you're number 60, you got called, you're drafted. There would be way too much push against that. So yeah, very limited kind of peacetime draft, more focused on just the Selective Service Act in general, more focused on, like, they called it more like national defense and such. But after Pearl Harbor was attacked, 60,000 men enlisted in the Army that month alone, and they also enlisted in the Air Force. And then, of course, we come out with the actual real official draft in the following months. Now, in World War II, unlike World War I, where the soldiers were called doughboys, in World War II, the soldiers are called GIs, or government issued, because these men, as they got drafted, they would, they had to, sign up under the Selective Service Act if they were 18 to 44. And then if there's numbers called, they are drafted. Yet again, they would push for the men to volunteer, saying there's so many benefits. You can go with people you know, be stationed together, have each other's back. So some people were volunteering, but other people waited till they were drafted. And, they'd come, they'd do their draft card. They'd, already approved their physical, their health check, all that. They had their draft card with them. They had their bag. But then, of course, all that stuff was kind of put to the side because you can only take a few personal items with you. And it's all about government issued everything, every single, article of clothing. You get to pick your own underwear, but that's about it. Otherwise, everything the government is pretty much giving you, and you have only a few personal items from home because you're going to be out and about. Who knows where you're going? And of course, you're going to need a very different uniform if you are going to Siberia compared to if you're going to Africa. And so, these men are getting their food kits and anything and everything they're going to need. And so they started to joke about the lack of quality, the scratchy uniforms. Some were too hot, some were too cold, some were poorly made. And just, they would talk about their government issued food stipend, their pay, whatever it was. And so they became known as GIs, as these 6 million men volunteered and 10 million men were drafted. And of course, like always, they were excited to fight. They didn't think the war was necessarily going to be over very quickly. They didn't kind of have that optimism that they had with World War I, because they knew they had a heck of a fight on their hands, because they had to obviously fight this two-front war against Hitler and against Japan. And they were going to be sending some of their troops as well into Africa. So it's really a three-front war if you want to be technical. So they don't quite have that optimism. They're not even sure how they're going to get into Europe, because Hitler controls the whole continent. So they're going to have to be planning and thinking about, how do you really start the attack? They're thinking about defense at home as well, which really wasn't a big concern in World War I once Mexico didn't align themselves with Germany. So the men are scared or apprehensive. They don't quite have as much optimism, but they also are filled with this new vigor to fight, because they see and they say, okay, if the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, my hometown could be next. So they are willing to go and fight and die and protect their families for the most part. And naturally, once they're gone from home, it is difficult. They, miss their families. They write letters. A lot of that is censored, where the government really kind of limits what's said. You can see these men here in their typical World War II uniforms, and they're paratroopers, so they're going to be jumping out of planes into Nazi-occupied France. Some men, obviously, depending on intelligence, might become spies, especially if they can speak different languages. These men are obviously one of the most famous pictures at Iwo Jima, as they're able to take that and finally raise the U.S. flag there in the Pacific. To try to kind of encourage morale amongst the ranks and to not get the soldiers depressed, they would let them kind of let off steam. And so occasionally they would have celebrities come, like this is Marlene Dietrich, to come in and sing to the troops or act out plays and shows, just to try to, give them something to look forward to. It's been very common throughout the years for presidents to go and visit the troops on holidays, or the general, something of that nature, to try to, get the people excited, to fight and to build that motivation, saying, you deserve some fun because you're dealing with these hellish situations every day. Now, when it comes to World War II, we see that there are some differences where we do see some Native Americans who do volunteer to fight, because Native Americans at this point, remember, are considered citizens. They gained citizenship during the 1920s, so some Native Americans do volunteer. They're not really drafting Native Americans, but we do see some volunteer. And then as the war goes on, there are going to be going after the Navajo Indians, and they are going to be trying to draft them in particular because they want them to be breaking secret codes as the Navajo code talkers. And we'll talk more about them here coming up and the role of codes as far as secrecy. So we do see some Native Americans that are in the war. We do see some Hispanic Americans who are in the war, but we don't see a ton of Mexican Americans who are fighting as much. But there are some. One of the big changes, though, is African Americans. World War I, African Americans were allowed to fight in segregated units, but they were doing non-combat duties. Besides the Harlem Hellfighters, who fought towards the very end of the war in France, and suffered heavy casualties and won some medals, we really didn't see African Americans in combat. And that really continued after World War I and now into World War II. African Americans were allowed to serve in the military in segregated positions, and they were allowed to, have lower class, supposedly, positions, like they were in kitchen duty or, janitorial stuff, logistics, so like moving supplies. They weren't allowed to actually be infantry or fight. There was a lot of racism there, where people felt like African Americans were not skilled. In World War II, that's finally going to change, and we're going to see that they are going to be separate African American, infantry units, which will face, fierce combat in the Army, and we're going to see separate African American units in the Air Force. The military is not going to get integrated until 1948 when Harry S. Truman says this is ridiculous. African Americans served just as white Americans. In World War II, this racism needs to end, and so he integrates the military. It's one of the first steps towards integration in America. But during World War II, that doesn't actually happen yet. So one of the other things that's happening is that there is a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph, and he was a railroad porter. So he helped carry people's luggage on the railroad, and he had created a union for different African Americans who worked on the railroads, who basically were porters or carried people's luggage. And they had pushed for, better wages, better conditions years ago. And he had become a real civil rights leader. He's working with a group called CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality. And he meets with FDR, and he says, I think it's ridiculous that if you're serving in the military and you are Black, that you are getting paid less than someone who is white and you are the same rank as them. And so he helps push for that. And they create the Fair Employment Practices Commission, and they start, getting higher pay for African Americans. And so unlike World War I, where the U.S. was not actively drafting African Americans, in World War II they are. Many African Americans, though, who are not drafted, there is a second Great Migration. And so many African Americans do leave the South or areas where unemployment was still, existing, more in rural portions of America. They move to big cities, they get jobs in factories to try to, help the fact that all these soldiers who've already been drafted, they're going to take those jobs. And you can kind of see here the second wave of Great Migration, which really starts here in 1940 and goes all the way through in 1970. Because the reason it's happening is in the South, there's really only two big cities. You see Charleston there is a really big city with a lot of factories. That's kind of one of them. And then at this point, we see that like Atlanta had quite a bit of factories as well. But otherwise, a lot of those southern cities, it was still all agriculture based. So they're not really producing a lot of wartime goods. Unemployment still existed there. A lot of these African Americans were still sharecroppers, working somebody else's land. And yes, food did need to be produced, but there's also new technology, new farm equipment that people were using. So African Americans were not needed, or anyone for that matter, as much, since technology and tractors and such were doing the work that people used to do by hand. So a lot of people do move to the big cities to get factory jobs to help produce all these wartime goods, waiting basically until they were drafted or volunteering. Now, A. Philip Randolph goes on to lead what he calls the Double Victory Campaign. And this one is definitely on the test. He calls it the Double V Campaign, where he says we need to be pushing for not just African Americans to be treated better in the military, where they're going to get, equal pay and get to serve, at least in combat, even if they're in segregated units. But we need to be pushing for African American rights at home. We need to be ending some of these Jim Crow laws, these legalized segregation. He threatens to lead a march on Washington to protest the discrimination that was still existing, because African Americans who are going to get jobs in factories as they moved north, they were being told they were going to get paid less than their white counterparts simply because of their color of their skin. And he says this is unacceptable. And so he goes to the president yet again, and he says, you need to do something about this. You have this Office of War Mobilization. They need to have some standardization here. We need to stop these discriminatory, hiring practices where you're paying Blacks less than whites. And we did see some changes happen. And I think we're just about done here. More than 1 million African Americans served in segregated units under the command of white officers. The last thing to really talk about, though, would be the Tuskegee Airmen. You might have heard of them before. These were African Americans who had attended in their younger years Tuskegee Industrial Institute. So they, were perhaps welders, had some kind of vocational skills. Maybe they were mechanics. They were well-educated men. Like, they're not necessarily like lawyers and scholars. Some of them were, though. And so they say we are clearly capable of, being an infantry. They were one of the first groups to really push, for African Americans to be in combat, and they were really in close communication with A. Philip Randolph. And eventually, they do great deeds during World War II. They're able to, kill many members of the enemy, and so today they're still recognized for their heroism and bravery. It has to be about 15 years ago now. I heard one of them speak, And he was telling kind of his stories about, just how crazy it was, how scary it was to be in World War II, and about how the 332nd Fighter Group flew 200 missions and they didn't lose a single member to enemy aircraft, yet they were able to blow up so many, German planes. It was pretty impressive overall. And that wraps us up, guys. Have a great day. Later.